I want you to imagine stepping out onto a thin steel beam, just, hundreds of meters above the concrete pavement of 1932 Manhattan.
Oh, and the wind, you have to imagine the wind is just howling off the Hudson River, actively pulling at your clothes.
Exactly. And just a few inches past your boots, there is a straight, infinite drop to the street below.
Mhm.
But here's the thing. When you look beside you, suspended along this narrow piece of steel, there are 11 men, and they aren't holding on to anything.
Right, they aren't bracing themselves at all. They're acting as if they're just sitting on a park bench on a quiet Sunday afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, one is casually lighting a cigarette, another is reading the daily paper. They're just leaning into each other, having a chat.
And the tension, when you look at the scene, when you really look at it, isn't actually about the fear of heights. It's the profound cognitive dissonance of it all.
It really is. It's like watching someone calmly sip a cup of coffee while sitting inside a burning building. Your brain simply cannot reconcile the absolute mortal danger of the environment with the complete physical relaxation of the people inside it.
The environment is actively demanding a survival response, but the subjects are completely ignoring that demand. Visually, it forces the viewer into this state of psychological gridlock. We are, of course, talking about the most famous photograph of the 20th century, lunch atop a skyscraper.
And that psychological gridlock is exactly what we're focusing on for this deep dive. This whole shift in perspective is actually inspired by an incredible article from sanalsergi.com.
Right, the piece titled Bu fotoğraf neden bu kadar paylaşıldı? Lunch atop a skyscraper and görünmeyen gerçeği.
Yeah, which essentially translates to asking why this photo was shared so much and exploring its inevitable truth. Our mission today is not just to talk about the history of a photograph.
Yeah.
We want to deconstruct how we trust images and why that trust is incredibly fragile.
Because the best place to start this whole analysis is with that immediate, almost uncritical surrender to the image. When people see those 11 men on the beam, the initial reaction is usually just pure awe.
Oh, definitely. People just assume that iron workers in the 1930s were, psychologically built differently, that they were completely immune to the fear of heights.
Exactly. We feel the clash between the deadly drop and the relaxed posture, yet we rarely question the reality of the moment. We just default to accepting it as pure, unfiltered truth.
Which raises such an interesting point about how our modern brains process visual information. It actually reminds me a lot of how we consume social media today.
Oh, how so?
Well, processing an image like this feels very similar to, reading a sensational headline without actually clicking through to read the article. The brain processes the visual headline, the man on a beam, the city far below, and just accepts the premise.
Because doing the actual cognitive work to audit the image is exhausting.
Exactly. Actively questioning the shadows or analyzing the physics of the body language, it just takes way too much mental energy.
And the cognitive psychology behind that is fascinating. I mean, the human brain is essentially an engine of efficiency. It is constantly looking for shortcuts to save processing power.
So when the visual cortex takes in a photograph, the absolute path of least resistance is just total acceptance.
Right, because to actively doubt an image requires you to engage the prefrontal cortex. You have to analyze spatial relationships, lighting anomalies, biological plausibility, and like you said, it's exhausting. But beyond just our biological wiring, there is a very heavy historical context to why we trust this specific photo.
Yeah, we have to put ourselves in the mindset of the 1930s. They weren't dealing with digital manipulation or AI-generated images. Photography was a deeply physical process.
It was a process of chemistry and light. In the 1930s, the raw, gritty nature of black and white photography wasn't really viewed as an art form capable of lying. It was universally understood as an infallible scientific recording device.
Because silver halide crystals physically reacted to light, so the resulting image was treated as objective physical proof of an event.
Precisely. The camera acted as an unquestioned proxy for the viewer. I mean, a normal person in 1932 couldn't physically hover 250 meters in the air off the side of a skyscraper to verify the scene themselves.
So because you couldn't independently verify that terrifying vantage point, you just transferred your trust entirely to the machine that could. You surrender to the camera.
You do. But before we go any further into the illusion, we really need to ground this in the terrifying physical facts. Because the illusion only works because it is built on a foundation of brutal reality.
Right. We don't want anyone thinking this was just painted in a studio or spliced together in a dark room. The men really were up there.
They absolutely were. It's September 20th, 1932. The location is the 69th floor of the Rockefeller Center construction site. Those 11 workers are genuinely suspended over the city.
With no safety harnesses hidden under those heavy coats. No safety net strung up below the beam.
None. The modern protective gear that we would expect on a construction site today simply didn't exist. And this wasn't some exaggerated one-off stunt for the era either. It was a grim reflection of actual 1930s labor conditions.
Because you have to remember the economic reality. It's the Great Depression. Men were lining up for blocks just for the chance to do this incredibly dangerous work so they could feed their families.
Workplace mortality in high-rise construction was a daily accepted statistic. The danger in the photograph is not an invention. It was the literal atmosphere these men breathed every single day.
Which brings us to a really sharp guiding question. If the danger is completely real, and these men face horrific, actual death every single day on the job, why does the resulting photograph feel so suspiciously sterile?
That's the crack in the foundation, isn't it? It feels perfectly balanced and entirely devoid of genuine human terror.
Exactly. When you move from the physical facts to the subtle psychological inconsistencies, the perfection of the image starts to fracture, because the biology of survival actively contradicts what we are seeing.
Right. Human beings are biological creatures governed by a nervous system that severely prioritizes staying alive. When a human body is placed near a lethal ledge, your amygdala triggers an involuntary response.
Your muscles instantly tense up.
Yes, your body naturally alters its center of gravity to pull away from the void. Your proprioception, your sense of where your body is in physical space, just goes into absolute overdrive.
You can't just casually switch off millions of years of evolutionary survival instincts to, have a relaxed chat while dangling your boots over an 800-foot drop.
You would see it in the rigidity of their necks, the way their shoulders hike up, how their hands grip the steel. But the men on the beam exhibit this loose, almost theatrical relaxation.
It's theatrical because it actively betrays natural human instinct. And then if you look at the composition itself, you have 11 men spaced out with this almost rhythmic perfection.
One drinking, two in a deep argument, one smoking at the far end.
Right, and authentic moments of rest on a chaotic, deafening construction site just don't organically organize themselves into perfectly spaced narrative harmonies. Life rarely provides that kind of organic perfection.
But the most damning evidence isn't even the men on the beam. It's the undeniably impossible location of the camera itself.
Oh, this is the part that completely shatters the reality for me. Because if you look at the angle of the shot, the photographer isn't looking up from a secure floor below, and they aren't shooting down from a crane above.
The lens is positioned at the exact same elevation, dead center.
Meaning the photographer is also suspended hundreds of meters in the air, basically floating directly across from them in the void.
And we have to remember the technology of 1932. A professional architectural photographer was not using a lightweight digital camera. They were using heavy, large format equipment.
Massive wooden and metal boxes that required heavy, sturdy tripods.
Exactly. The photographer had to slide a fragile glass plate into the back, pull a heavy dark cloth over their head to focus the image upside down, manually calculate the exposure, and then trigger the shutter.
It's a highly premeditated, exhausting physical setup. You don't just spontaneously hover in midair with 50 pounds of glass and wood to capture a quick, candid lunch break.
At what point does a moment stop being a spontaneous slice of life and become a rigidly prepared stage?
Well, that underlying tension completely shatters when you look at the archival evidence. Because this was never a candid moment. It was a highly organized, directed performance.
The archives from that exact same session are mind-blowing. They show alternate takes of the same workers on the same beam, performing entirely different absurd scenarios.
Yeah, like the shot where the men are pretending to be fast asleep, using their arms as pillows while lying flat on the narrow steel over the abyss.
Or the one where they are staging a fake boxing match with men literally holding up their fists while balancing over the drop.
A boxing match. Over an 800-foot drop. It completely destroys the idea that this was just a group of guys eating sandwiches. It transforms them from documented workers into directed actors.
And the motive behind this direction is deeply tied to the context of the Great Depression. Rockefeller Center was this massive, unprecedented private real estate venture during the bleakest economic days in American history.
John D. Rockefeller Jr. was trying to lease out millions of square feet of commercial office space, while businesses across the country were shuttering by the thousands.
So the Rockefeller Center press team crafted this entire photo shoot as a calculated public relations campaign. They needed to manufacture a symbol.
They needed to project capitalist resilience, unbothered strength, and unwavering progress.
Exactly. They wanted to sell hope to a desperate nation. And more practically, they needed to sell real estate to businesses. So they packaged these striking images and sent them to newspaper syndicates across the country.
Which raises such a dark moral question when you think about it. They basically hijacked the raw, desperate reality of Great Depression iron workers men risking their lives daily just to survive, and directed them like a Broadway play to sell commercial leases.
It completely changes our perception of the image. The bravery we admire wasn't organic defiance. It was a requested pose paid for by a corporate press office.
But the staging is really just the first layer of the deception. The dialogue gets so much darker when we descend into the mechanics of framing. Because the deepest manipulation isn't about what the camera shows us.
It's about what the camera deliberately hides.
Right. Because the entire emotional power of that photograph, that visceral drop in your stomach when you look at it, relies completely on the absolute void beneath the worker's feet.
The infinite drop is the whole point. Without it, it's just a mundane picture of guys eating lunch.
But the reality of skyscraper construction dictates a completely different truth. You cannot engineer a 70-story steel frame by leaving a sheer, open drop all the way to the street beneath the active working level.
It's a logistical impossibility. Construction crews always laid down thick timber, planking a few floors below the active steel erection.
Right, to catch dropped rivets, heavy tools, materials, to stop them from becoming lethal projectiles to the pedestrians down on the street.
Exactly. So just a few meters below the camera's careful cutoff line, there's almost certainly a fully planked, completed wooden floor.
Meaning, if one of those men had slipped off the beam during the photo shoot, they wouldn't have suffered that cinematic, plummeting death to the Manhattan streets.
No, they would have fallen maybe 10 or 15 feet. They might have broken a leg or suffered a severe injury, which is still a terrible workplace accident, of course.
But it's a manageable workplace hazard, not a death-defying myth. The photographer intentionally tilted the lens to crop out that safety floor, manufacturing a deadly abyss out of thin air.
It is a masterclass in the aggressive physics of framing. By manipulating the focal length and the crop, the photographer eliminated the immediate background and forced your eye to connect the men directly to the distant city grid.
The void only exists because the wooden floor was aggressively excluded from the frame. And honestly, realizing that fills me with this profound sense of betrayal.
The betrayal regarding the nature of photography itself.
Yes, because if simply tilting a lens to remove a few inches of visual information can completely rewrite reality, then aren't we, as viewers, completely at the mercy of whoever holds the scissors?
We are. And that realization forces us to widen the lens from this single 1932 photograph to the universal mechanics of visual media. The core philosophy here is that a photograph is never a transparent window into reality.
It is always an aggressive act of exclusion.
Precisely. By drawing a physical border around a specific piece of the world, the photographer is aggressively deciding what ceases to exist for the viewer. Whatever is pushed into the dark outside the frame completely dictates the meaning of what is left in the light.
And when you think about it, this historical PR stunt is really the prototype for our modern visual world. Every single day, we navigate an environment where every image we consume is a filtered, packaged conclusion.
And those packaged conclusions deliberately hide the messy, contradictory process of their creation.
Think about the endless scrolling of a social media feed. Every seemingly perfect digital moment you consume today, the flawless vacation sunset, the immaculate living room, the happy couple.
It's just another version of an invisible wooden floor being cropped out to maintain an illusion of perfection.
Exactly. The argument right before the selfie, the crushing debt financing the lifestyle, the mess just off camera, it is all pushed outside the frame. The mechanism is identical to what they did in 1932.
Which means we have to permanently change our baseline approach to consuming media. When you look at a striking image now, you can never again just ask what the photographer managed to capture.
Oh, wait, the first question has to be, what did the photographer decide I was not allowed to see? You have to train your brain to actively look for the invisible borders.
Because the borders are where the actual story is constructed. The intellectual journey of looking at lunch atop a skyscraper reaches a very unsettling destination when you consolidate all these facts.
The 11 men on the beam were actors, playing a role for a camera that was deliberately lying by omission.
Wielded by an institution with a very specific agenda to shape public perception, which leaves us with the foundational truth we've uncovered during this deep dive.
A photograph does not show reality. It performs it.
It selects the wardrobe, sets the lighting, hides the stagehands, and delivers a monologue disguised as a documentary.
And if a photographer nearly a century ago could use a heavy wooden box and a simple tilt of a lens to crop out reality so effectively that we all believed the performance for decades, we have to ask ourselves what happens next.
Especially as we enter an era flooded with entirely synthetic, algorithmic realities.
Exactly. The manipulation isn't just about what is left out of the physical frame anymore. We are now generating the frame from thin air. It leaves you with a really provocative thought to mull over.
What's that?
When people a century from now look back at the visual record of our current lives, will they have any tools left to find our invisible wooden floors? Or will the performance finally become the only history we have?